Good news from South Africa. Good news for us too. That was the name of the song by a South African musician.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Before I begin, let's recognize Ian Sidney March for his musical introduction to the program. We'll be hearing from Sidney as a presenter later on in the program. But for now, I want to welcome everyone to Splendid Wake 8 online. I am Henry Crawford, and I'll be leading us today on a journey celebrating DC's poetic history and honoring its past and present seers and visionaries. The idea behind Splendid Wake is to memorialize the work of poets who have lived, worked, volunteered, or have been active in a group in the DC metro area. Our goal is to ultimately celebrate the depth and breadth of DC's literary communities. So let me say a word about our online reading. This year, our program is online in Zoom as the result of the coronavirus pandemic. But you can also follow the program on our Splendid Wake website. And I've just put in a link in the chat to the site where you can actually follow along on your phone, tablet, or computer. You can actually bring up the program if you go to the program page, and you'll be able to follow the program instead of having a paper one, which we usually hand out. So please feel free to explore the website for additional information about today's program. This year, we'll be honoring poet Stanley Plumley with a tribute. We'll also be taking a retrospective view of poet and diplomat John C. Brown, as well as a look at Howard's Missing Poets and the famous Iota Poetry Series, which ran for many years in Arlington, Virginia. We have a great selection of presenters and programs, so let's get started. And we will begin by letting me introduce you to Jennifer King, the librarian at the Gelman Library, George Washington University, which is usually the host of this event. And so let's bring Jennifer King to the Zoom stage here and let her say a few words about Splendid Wake.
Sure. So thank you. I'm actually so grateful for the Splendid Wake programming crew, committee, amazing people who really organize this and put it on. And yes, it's usually hosted in our facility, and obviously we can't do that. But I actually think that in some ways this might allow more people to come. So I think this is in some ways a nice alternative, although not for good reasons, I suppose. But I wanted to mention to everyone that one thing that we do at Gelman Library, and specifically in special collections where I work, is we have the Washington Writers Archive. And what we are trying to do is document the writing community. And specifically, we actually focus a lot on the poetry community within DC. And so I'm happy to talk to anyone who has books they've published, chapbooks, anything that they have that they think helps tell the story of the interaction among the poetry community here in DC. Happy to have a conversation, happy to talk to anyone about what we're doing and what we're trying to do and how they can assist with that. Maybe even get on the Splendid Wake programming committee and help host these terrific events that we do. And I see Myra shaking her head. Yes, yes, we are always looking for more people to participate and to bring, sort of their historical knowledge of the poetry community and present it to people like we're going to do today. So I'm just grateful for everyone, and let's have a great program.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you for your remarks. It is the mission of Splendid Wake to remember DC area poets who have recently passed away. And this year we want to pay special tribute to Lynn Lifshin. And we are going to have Albert Jordan will do a short presentation in memory of Lynn Lifshin.
Good afternoon. My name is Albert Jordan, or Jordan as Lynn would call me. I'm sure you realize Lynn was amazingly prolific. She wrote over 130 books and chapbooks and edited 4 anthologies of women's writers. For her dedication to the small presses, which first published her, and for managing to survive on her own, apart from any academic institution, she earned the distinction of Queen of Small Presses. The scope of her subjects was very broad, from personal reflections of women to horse racing, Indian life in New Mexico, Aleppo, Joni Mitchell, doctors. She had Madonna humor poems, Katrina, and a Jesuit, to name a few. To give you an idea of the number of poetry magazines that published her, I ask you to look behind me, in which are stored some of them. In a sense, to give you a little background of her life, in a sense, there were 3 broad phases. First, she was born in Vermont and grew up in Middlebury in one of the few Jewish families. She was discriminated against. She tried to be perfect. She studied hard and skipped 2 years in school and got a state science award. She got married. She almost got a PhD, but ran into sexism and was prevented from finishing. Eventually, the marriage became too stifling. In what evolved into the second phase of her life, she broke out, first writing about sexual emancipation, and then following up by divorcing and living in an emancipated way. It was in this period that she wrote her signature poem, The No More Apologizing, The No More Laughing, Little Laughing Blues. She was known as an early feminist. It was in the later part of this life that I met her. Pardon me. After some years, we became monogamous. I would say that happened as she moved into the third phase of her life, one of being more mellow. We lived together for 27 years, mainly in DC and Vienna, Virginia, but also in Niskayuna and New York. She was grateful that Dean Bliard, Miles Moore, Judy McCombs, Jackie Jules, and others introduced her to the DC poetry scene. I thought I would give you some thoughts about perhaps how she was able to be so prolific. My guess, and that's all it is that her secrets were first to ignore certain things, like cell phones and cooking. You can guess who had to deal with food procurement and preparation if he wanted to eat. Second, she could be amazingly focused. For example, she wrote 4 books on racehorses, books that received some excellent reviews, including from people in horse racing. However, she would not go to the race course to actually watch a race, only to see the horses, because she thought that would be too upsetting. But she did buy over 24 books to get a sense of it. Before I close with a short poem of hers, I thought I would mention that she was also, pardon me, an avid ballet and ballroom dancer and loved foreign films and international travel. A poem she read often was My Mother and the Bed. No, not that way, she'd say when I was 7, pulling the bottom sheet smooth. You've got to, saying, hospital corners. I wet the bed much later than I should. Until just writing this, I hadn't thought of the connection. My mother would never sleep on sheets someone else had. I never saw any stains on hers, though her bedroom was a maze of powder, hairpins, black dresses. She used to bring her own sheets to my house, carried toilet seat covers. Lynn, did anyone sleep in my, she always asked. Her sheets, her hair smelled of smoke. But she says, the rooms here smell funny. We drove at 3 a.m. slowly into Boston and stripped what looked like 2 clean beds as the sky got light. I smoothed on the form-fitted flower bottom. She redid it. She thought of my life as a bed only she could make right. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Albert Jordan and remembering Lynn Lifshin. Thank you so much. So now we can turn to our first presenter, Joanne Rocky Delaplane, a real good friend of mine, who will lead us in a tribute to the poet, teacher, and past Maryland Poet Laureate, Stanley Plumley. Rocky Delaplane, Rocky as we know her in this community, is a past co-director of the WordWorks Cafe Muse Literary Salon. Her first book of poetry is The Local World, which was published in 2019. Her poems have won the Best of the Net, the Bethesda Literary Festival Poetry Contest, and the Northern Virginia Review Contest. She was a longtime student of Stanley Plumley. So let's join with Rocky Delaplane in this tribute to her friend and mentor, Stanley Plumley. Take it away, Rocky. You're muted. Unmute. There you go.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Splendid Wake organizers, and thank you, friends. Stan once said in class, one does not live alone in this art. Stan came from Quaker Welsh heritage. He believed in democracy. His impact on our region's literary life was indelible as teacher, as writer, as friend, and builder of poetry community. Since I fell in love with his teaching before I fell in love with his poetry, I'll begin there. I needed to meet the man and absorb his method to fully engage with his poems. When I first read his poems, I found them difficult. As I came to understand his vision, honed over nearly half a century of writing, I found his work heartbreaking, life-enhancing, and utterly compelling. I had the honor of studying with Stan over 11 years, including the last 3 years of his life at a church basement near his home in Frederick, with a cohort of about 13, whom he once lovingly dubbed his tribe. He could be Zen master tough and held us to his own high standards. He'd admonish us to just do the work or write a simple sentence, but then follow that up with an affectionate, you'll learn, kiddo. Stan believed poetic craft could be taught. Not only did he teach creative writing and English literature students at University of Maryland for 34 years, after stints at the universities of Washington, Houston, Columbia, Iowa, and Princeton, he also consistently reached out to working adults at community-based literary communities such as the Writers Center here and the Hugo House in Seattle, by teaching night and weekend non-academic classes. He loved teaching. He invested in his students and brought his passion for poetry to every class. Kevin Kraft called Stan one of the most influential and meaningful teachers I've had. Rita Dove said he shepherded my first attempts at poetic sequence past the naysayers, opening me to a world of possibilities. Poet translator Nancy Naomi Carlson said, Stan taught me there was no such thing as writer's block. Poet Claire McGough said, I refer to my Stanley notes whenever I need discipline and inspiration. Classes with Stan were lessons in craft, poetic tradition, character, and vocabulary. Verisimilitude, he would say, rolling the word languidly on his tongue. Verisimilitude. Do you know that word? He'd ask softly in a rich baritone voice that could also bellow, whisper, or trail off into silence. It sounds like very similar, verisimilitude, very similar. Stan believed our poems should be grounded in a particular experience. If you wanted to hear his every word, you'd sit near. But if you were afraid of getting clobbered, most of us were, and clobbered could mean being the recipient of his bushy-eyebrowed, withering stare, you wanted, as Claire once joked in his presence, a bike helmet on your head. He had an imposing physicality. It took confidence to sit close. Isn't it interesting that author and authority have the same root? He'd inquire. He loved grand pronouncements such as, we live in a Chekhovian universe, not a Dostoevskian one. Or the more mundane, Beethoven wrote the best symphony. Stan knew his authority came from life experience, working through inner and outer conflict, but he was not authoritarian. Like a strong wrestler, he loved a good fight. He wanted you to push back. McGough keeps the following Stanleyisms on her bulletin board. Once you have left the object and start drawing conclusions, you have left your poem. So much of what we do is about yielding. You cannot be superior to your poem. You are your poem. Vulnerability is your strength, not your weakness. Don't try to be so meaningful. Be meaningless, because you can't. Poet and poetry teacher Bonnie Naradze, in a poem dedicated to Stan called Lament for the Maker, just published in Agni, remembers Stan saying, there are only 6 shapes in nature, and one is the meander. And don't be in a hurry to send out poems. Let it take years. It's awful when you can't get what you want. Poet Dr. Susan Oakey, in her poem Advice to Poets from Stanley Plumley, quotes Stan as saying, come to the page with a full heart and empty mind. See, don't think your way out. Don't be afraid to screw up. And what is the language of the experience? I tried to channel Stan's teaching essence in the following poem, My Plumley. Love, death, and a good long think, he said, are the occasions for poetry. If you can film it, you can write it. Don't worry about being a poet. Just try to capture the moment. This is a terrible poem. Tone is everything. It's not what you intend. It's what you discover in the writing. I do favor a certain formalism. form as your father, your mother. Pay attention to the music. Silence is one of your sources, or should be. Never let the will do the work of the imagination. If you want to grow as a poet, put yourself in your poem. Your obsessions are your prompts. You have centuries to turn to. Learn from the poets before you, not as competition, but as support. He knew which poets were drunks. When he recited poems, he'd quiet to a whisper, would lean in, straining. You never stop revising your poems until you die. Bad writing can kill you. It should kill you. You should die of it. You're lucky if you have 5 readers. Where is the poem taking place? You give up such power when you don't tell us. Poems are elegies. If not, why write them? Passion, he insisted, is what really matters, praised Frost's directive. A poet should never have the last word. When you end, close the door quietly. Never let the will do the work of the imagination was a Yeats quote, and by imagination, I think Stan meant our memories, dreams, those archetypal presences such as fathers and mothers that haunt our lives. Stan was tough, not just because he wanted us to demand more of ourselves. He knew the difficulties of turning again and again to the blank page. But there were consolations to being beaten with his proverbial Zen stick. After class, we'd walk to a local restaurant, enjoy good food, a good bottle of red wine, and good conversation. Stan enjoyed this creaturely life. He welcomed our family members and introduced us to his beloved wife, Margaret. He'd stop and talk to dogs passing by. He was curious about our respective professions, both making fun of them and admiring the way they entered our poems. Always put at least one fact in your poem, he'd say. Stan loved quoting a good pun. John Keats is dying, can something be done about it? He wrote blurbs for our books, came to our readings, helped us get jobs, introduced us to editors. This on top of his academic and writing load, family duties, including shopping and cooking, and in his final years, managing his illness. Stan's work ethic was ferocious. Just as he advised us, he wrote and revised until the end. At his University of Maryland memorial service, Stan's Norton editor and former student, Jill Bielowski, told us that in the middle of editing Middle Distance, he texted her, "Jill, I'm dying." Poet and retired Catholic University professor Rosemary Winslow received an essay on beauty written over the last summer of his life. It's just published in a collection of essays called Deep Beauty. Stan published 11 books of poetry, 3 books of nonfiction, and a book of essays on poetic craft. He edited poetry anthologies and magazines, conducted and granted interviews, gave readings, including 2 at the Folger Library, and taught classes at Breadloaf in Sicily, the Gettysburg Review Summer Writers Workshop, Hope Snyder's Sotto Voce Poetry Festival in Shepherdstown, a residency in Prague, and gave popular lectures at AWP conferences. He served as Maryland's Poet Laureate from 2009 to 2018, going to classrooms and introducing kids of all ages to poetry. His books were awarded finalists for the National Book Award and won the LA Times Book Prize, the Truman Capote Prize for Literary Criticism, the Patterson Poetry Prize, and the Delmore Schwartz Memorial Poetry Award. He received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. Did the man ever sleep? David Baker called Stanley Plumley his favorite poet. Rita Dove said his poems were kind and ferocious and funny and sad, and called him the successor to James Wright and John Keats. When I summed up the liminal quality of Stan's poems in 2014 for a reading he gave at Cafe Muse, I said, referring to the poem Kitty Hawks in his book Orphan Hours, which opens with the Wright brothers flying a kite, Kitty Hawks with a lowercase k. Here is wordplay and mystery. Plumley holds something back, invites our interrogation, rewards our participation. Kites are a kind of hawk. For Plumley, birds suggest the human spirit, and this poet has spent his patient, poetic lifetime describing the fleeting, the flying, the falling, birds, butterflies, clouds, light, autumn leaves, rain, snow. Natural processes, the pull of gravity and the passing of time, are not denied but embraced. Like kites, we will be blown to rags. Our mortal bodies and the poem's body, its form, are both limit and gift, source of dread, and our most beautiful music. Rooted in the palpable, his poems pulse with eros, suffused with loss, they forgive our foibles. His poems startle our thought and wake us to deeper presence. We're alive, enlivened because of him. Of his most recent book, Middle Distance, Linda Gregerson writes, "This is the poet's final blessing, to hold the precious world in two good hands and say goodbye." On April 11th, 2019, Stan died just short of his 80th birthday. I was on retreat in rural Ohio in a town not unlike Piqua, where Stan moved from Winchester, Virginia when he was 7. Parenthetically, I just learned Piqua was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and in the language of the Shawnee tribe means he who comes out of the ashes. Stan would have loved that. Maybe he knew. When I got the news, I went outside, walked barefoot under the stars, and cried. Before I came in, I said, "Now you are a red-winged blackbird." Goodbye, Stan. May your spirit and writing continue to soar. And while you taught us a poet should never have the last word, today I grant you the last word. Here are the last 6 lines from the poem Vesper Sparrow, published in Orphan Hours, Stan's 10th book of poems. Imagine him asking what bird you'd like to be, as he once asked us in class, and listen as he answers his own question. Those of us who wish at last for red wings want the yellow of the sun under the heart's blood on each wing, in measure just enough to remind us of where we've come from. The way the blackbird, opening to fly, brings back word from the old life to the new.
Thank you so much, Rocky Delaplane. That was a truly remarkable and beautiful bringing the spirit of Stanley Plumley to Splendid Wake Aid. Thank you. Okay, well, you've heard his music at the beginning of this program, and now we'll hear again from poet and all-around Renaissance man, Sydney March. He's a poet, essayist, musician, journalist, and educator, residing in Washington, D.C. His publications include Stealing Mangoes, essays and poetries published in numerous anthologies, including Beyond the Frontier, edited by Ethelbert Miller. He currently teaches English and creative writing at Montgomery College and edits the Sligo Journal. So let's bring Sydney March up to the Zoom podium to share with us his thoughts on poet and diplomat John C. Brown. Ian?
Thank you very much. Rock is a hard act to follow. I was enlightened. I was quite enlightened and entertained by the, and it was very instructive as a poet. Much to learn. I met John Brown in 1990, and it's serendipity. My mother met him at an airport coming from Canada, and he and his wife befriended my mom. My mom is not a poet, my mom, but I don't know exactly what the attraction was, but I said serendipitous. And she came up and she said, I met this gentleman and his wife. She seemed to be French. And they invited me to dinner. And I told him he wrote poetry. And I said, what? Come on now. Yeah, he writes, and he said you should visit him. He lives at Van Ness. And I said, he gave me a book of poems. And I'll let you look at it, but you have to give me back. And so he gave me, this is the book, Celebrations. It eventually would really give me a collection of his books, as these are, and I'll probably revisit them later, read a couple. But yeah, as I visited him, he would send books to me, exchange it, with talk. But then a little bit about him. Poet and scholar, diplomat, and foreign correspondent. He was born in 1914 and died in 2002. I met him in 1990. So, for the latter part of his life, I visited him frequently. And one of his archivists said, you're the only guy who really visited him at that time. He wasn't really fond of people. So I said, students, I would run into students every now and then leaving when I was arriving. Now, he was educated at Hamilton College and pursued his graduate work in medieval studies and comparative literature and at the Sorbonne in Paris, and received a PhD from Catholic University, and remained there as an instructor of Romance languages and literature for many, many years. And when I met him, he was still teaching graduate studies there and comparative literature. He served as an assistant for the foreign publications in the War Office of Information from 1942 to 1943, and was on the staff of the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, the precursor of the CIA, from 1943 to 1925. And then he later worked in the Foreign Service as a correspondent. He always said, Sydney, I was a cold warrior, mostly spinning propaganda for the United States. But that was my job. And he said, well, it took me to many places. And of course, after the war, he was based in Paris, while employed as European editor for the Mifflin Company, and as correspondent for the Sunday edition of the New York Times from 1945 to 49. That time, he contributed to numerous European and American journals. His extensive papers, consisting of the correspondence with numerous national and international luminaries, is housed at Georgetown University. Examples are of Josephine Baker, Elizabeth Bishop, Andrew Breton, Albert Camus, Carson McCullers, Wallace Stevens, Julian Green, who he mentored a bit when he was Julian Green. Actually, he told me he was a Southern man from Alabama, and he tried to conceal it very much by changing them to Julien when he became a famous writer in France. He wrote in French. His parents actually were American who moved to France. So, and he had stories about, and I'll spin some of them later on as I go along. Elizabeth Bishop, Camus, Carson McCullers, Kay Boyle, Hans Richter, Catherine and Porter, Chagall, St. John Pierce, Alice B. Tolkien, of course, who would be a big part of their life. As a matter of fact, if you heard her letters, letters staying on alone, has numerous letters from Brown and Simone, his wife, as a part of their correspondence. And I'll tell you a bit about them as I go on in my tell my story, because it's really meeting him and being fascinated by this man who belonged to another age, who rubbed shoulders with all the, Levi Strauss, Kissinger, Miguel Covarrubias, who was his friend and host in Mexico City when he taught there, Marian Moore, Juan Dos Passos, and so on. He was a champion of really many third world writers, or he actually nominated Mr. Octavia Paz for the prize, Neustadt Prize, and who would actually go on to win the Nobel, and many other writers, Ungaretti, the great Italian poet. Also, again, other writers like, most recently, at the end of his life, he actually promoted Nuruddin Farah, the Somali writer, who would win the Neustadt Prize, which is one of the huge literary prizes, international. And his posts were many. He worked as an official for the US government, as director of economic cooperation of the during the Marshall Plan, connected to the Marshall Plan, and of course, as chief of the U.S. Information Service at the U.S. Embassy in France. Cultural in 54 to 58, cultural attaché in Brussels, Belgium. 58 to 62, again, attaché in Rome. 68, attaché in Mexico City, Mexico. He had many posts. Fellow of the Advanced Studies at Wesleyan University in Middleton, and was awarded the Grand Prix and the Critique in Paris, France, and the Barry Bingham Distinguished Professor at the University of Louisville. Now, as I said, our meeting was serendipitous, and after visiting him, that first visit, I say, I came and sat in this place and looked around. He actually was not one to speak on the phone. The first time I called him at my mother's urging, Mama said, you gotta call him, you gotta call him. He said, did you call Mr. Brown? No, they're so nice, he wants you to. I said, okay. And I called and he said, well, what about Friday? Okay. And so, and I hadn't looked at the book, so I leafed through, and there was a piece dedicated to Balzac. It's called Ballad, and I read something that resonated. Prince, and he wrote a lot in aging. Can you tell the reason why our bodies age while our hearts beat so youthfully? Will you heed my cry? And many of his poets and poetry took that turn, telling us of the changes and the turning of the wheels of time and missing. And I'll read later a few of his poems. But then, about our conversations were many. He talked about Andrew Breton, and he was actually, one of his jobs was to make, during the war, it was accommodate the expatriates and the Americans and the French underground poets and so on, writers, artists who came here. And he said, he told Breton, if you're here, you should learn some English, because make yourself useful and you'll be a little more comfortable, because Breton wasn't really at home in America. And he said, Breton's in perfect French, and I don't speak French, so I'll say it in English. He turned his nose up and tarnished my French. Breton, and of course, and he talked about being in the company of Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound. At Hamilton College, Ezra Pound was his classmate. And he said, You know, Sydney, he had been cantankerous. Even as a, a young man, he spoiled for a fight. He was always looking for a fight. Um, there were people we talked about and stuck with me very much. He talked about Covarrubias. His wife was the first Irish cook in Mexico, the finest Irish cook in Mexico. Um, as and he said, and of course, he was very admiring of Alice B. Tolkien, who would stay with them after Gertrude Stein's death for many years in Rome and New York and Paris. He said, you know, I think she was the writer of many of Gertrude's, what was attributed to Gertrude. She was probably a much finer writer than Gertrude. And um, he said, well, and she had a mustache like a dragoon guard. So he went on, and it really had, you know, just many of these quips as we go on. Josephine Baker, who again befriended, they befriended while he was in Paris and was again accommodating American expatriates, so to speak, who came here. He actually promoted her shows in New York. And it says, well, you know, Sydney, in Rome, she once baked us a cake. But you know what they say about the dancing bear? Not the dancing. It's the fact that she actually baked the cake. So it was funny. Very, I said, it made you feel comfortable. He would serve, I remember Mr. Brown returned with a small tray on which two glasses filled. That's when I first visit with drinks. It asked me, well, I shouldn't, some refreshment if you not have no aversion to alcohol. And he said, this is just my special recipe, a touch of Napoleon, creme de menthe, and a few secret ingredients. I always serve this drink to my students. It renders them less critical and makes me more eloquent. And these were, and of course, he was always jovial, always thought, well, there's a light touch that makes things work. Even in his poem, he wanted, I remember when I first showed him a few poems, he said, yeah, you make it lighter. I said, yeah. And of course, he spoke so many of the artists and writers and painters and Hans Richter and you know, he knew them very closely. Darius Milhaud, lots of composers, and it's a joke, poke fun of some of them, and really and speak of the seriousness. Henry Miller, it said, you know, yeah, he played around, but he was very, very serious literary scholar. He lived it. He chased it. He loved it. He abused it, and yeah. But he was again, and many a day I would sit with him, and of course we'd talk. And I was really awed. He'd speak about all, and it's, you know, sometimes recite poems in French, Italian, forgetting that you know, and they get carried away. He taught comparative literature. He spoke Portuguese and so on, and he'd speak Andrade, Mario Andrade or Carlos Drummond. He'd recite pieces of in Portuguese. I love Carlos Drummond, but I can't write Portuguese or read Portuguese. But he'd read, and he knew them. Rubbed shoulders with so many of the great ones. And as a Breton and people like that, he was really pretty fond of them. And my meetings with him were always pretty delicious meetings. I came out giddy from the people he knew. One of his daughters actually was married to a member of the Politburo in China. And He said, you know, Sydney, she wears the pants in the family. And so, yeah. And so I'll read a few of his poems. Again, he exchanged, just send me books and always corresponded. Although I saw him pretty frequently, he would write and a bunch of letters and so on from him. And this is New York. Once there were too many bonds, the house heavy with memories, wax flowers under the glass globe, brass clock with its inexorable chime, the living room cluttered with furniture, the barn stuffed with discarded possessions of three generations, the baby's high chair, trunk filled with old hats, yellowed letters tied with ribbons, piles of mildewed books, broken toys and chemical set, a sofa with broken springs, a family album bound in reddish plush. No return now to the Elm Street, I have forgotten the way. Nor to the house I threw the key in the ocean. For another generation lounges at the creeks. They've torn down the opera house and made the Harter mansion into two-room flats. The world has vanished. How much a part of me it is and always will be, I shall never fully know. Only those houses, those names, those streets still haunt my dreams, keep a reality more dense than the shifting shadows landscapes at present. Do we have to sign the whole year's lease? Once there were so many markers to point the way to a stabilized world. The house, the street, a permanent dress, the old Ford touring car, the family, and neighbors you know by names, and the dog. This is making music. The call of the crow, the chirp of the chippy, the hiss of the snake, all of them make music. The buzz of the wasp, the bleat of the goat, the squawk of the drake, all of them make music. The whine of the saw, the hum of the drill, the screech of the brake, they also make music. The crackling of flames, the whisper of rain, the sigh of the lake, all of them make music. No need for the lute, no need for the vowel. Just open your ear and you will hear music. The mask. I write wearing a mask. Yes, a mask in the old Venetian style, long and sloping back on the forehead. It looks like a large white satin muzzle. And sitting here at my desk, I raise my head and look at myself in the mirror, front view first. Then I turn a bit to contemplate the childlike profile of mine, childlike, but with a hint of bestial about it. I like it. May some reader, the unknown brother to whom I speak, from behind this pale shining mask, come and plant a slow, insistent kiss on this receding forehead, on this pale cheek, and press firmly down on my face, this other face, perfumed and hollow. And this is for Victor Hugo. 4 locks of Victor Hugo's hair preserved here for posterity and labeled by the poet's hand speak eloquently of vanity, the vanity that rusts the heart of noblest and best, that brings a lofty genius down to make him seem like all the rest of us. Seems silly, cruel, and small. So human, oh so human too. We lust to spit upon the great, to stone the fallen lion at bay, and viciously to denigrate, boasting. We're just as good as they. But we know despite it all, the Orphic gifts are shared by few. And roots. all of us now are chronically displaced. We meet. He talked about moving a lot, and he did move a lot. He lived in so many places. Um, all of us now are chronically displaced. We meet. We mutter greetings and we part. We're heirs of change and haste. My only roots are in your heart. New York and Paris, Washington and Rome. We never stay to finish what we start. We live from bags and anywhere is home. My only roots are in your heart. But even when I see an ancient town where flowers blossom on the crumbling walls, where sons inhabit their ancestral halls, and great old elms look dimly down on gardens where the oriole calls, where all is fixed and men have roots like trees, and life is patterned like an art. I look at you and need not envy these. My deepest roots are in the heart. Oh my, Henry. On
Sydney,
time.
I think we might be running a little bit out of time here.
Okay, good. Well, at last, the great ones like old Voltaire knew very well the trusting reason. That trusting reason was only another subterfuge, another way of whistling in the dark, of finding courage to confront the void, of keeping the light on like frightened children the whole night through, to be able to sleep a little, if only fearfully and by fits and starts. Long live John Brown, a memorable twilight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's Ian Sidney March, and that was quite a walk through history and poetry. Thank you so much. But we have to keep moving on here. Raymond Maxwell is a prominent poet, librarian, archivist. He was born in Greensboro, North Carolina, and grew up in the milieu of the 1950s civil rights movement. Raymond will now lead us in examining Howard's hidden poets. So let me turn the Zoom camera right over to Raymond Maxwell.
Okay, thank you, Henry, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. In the interest of time, I'm going to narrow this down to one Howard professor who actually wrote a little bit of poetry on the side. I'll do a scene setter that sort of sets the scene. We'll read the poem, and I'll close with the closeout notes that I added to the file. The poet and professor I've selected was named Murs Tate. Murs Tate, historian and international relations theorist, was born in rural Michigan in 1905. She attended Western Michigan, Columbia, Oxford University, and the Geneva School of International Studies before completing her PhD at Radcliffe and Harvard. Tate began her teaching career in Indianapolis high schools, got her first college faculty appointment at Barbara Scotia College in North Carolina, moved on to Bennett College in my hometown, Greensboro, North Carolina, where she served as department chair for 4 years, and transferred to Morgan State in Baltimore, where she taught for 1 year before transferring to Howard. In 1942, she came to Howard, where she taught until her retirement in 1977. Tate died in 1996. She was 91 years old. Tate was an important scholar in the burgeoning field of international relations theory. Mentored and championed by her professor Hans Morgenthau, considered by many the father of political realism and international relations theory, Tate achieved national fame as a scholar, although she never received recognition to which she should have been entitled from her colleagues and administrators at Howard University. She published several books in her specialty areas, the sales of which enabled her to endow hundreds of thousands of dollars in scholarships at the colleges she attended and where she taught. Today's poem, and Murs Tate's lasting contribution to IR theory, international relations theory. Traditional IR theory is realpolitik, which is to say, simply, strong countries do what they want and weaker countries adapt and do what they must to survive. After World War II, theorists split among two groups, the realpolitik realists and the liberal internationalists, who believed that international and multilateral institutions like the UN and the World Trade Organization could preserve peace through the imposition of international systems with checks and balances. A more 1960s idea purported the democratic peace, that modern democracies would never go to war with one another, so the goal should be to spread and support democratic governance among and across nations. Maurice Tate came up with a much more advanced theory for world peace, way ahead of its time, and much more applicable to the modern network age in which we find ourselves today. Tate's idea was that information symmetry, preserving access to information about weapon capabilities, strategic intentions, and geopolitical aspirations across all national boundaries could and would prevent potential enemies from actually going to war. Sorry for this long introduction. Here is the Maurice Tate poem found in her papers at the Moreland Spingarn Research Institute, Moreland Spingarn Research Center, that encapsulates her theory of international peace. The poem is titled, "If I Knew You and You Knew Me." If I knew you and you knew me, 'tis seldom we would disagree. But never having yet clasped hand, both often fail to understand that each intends to do what's right and treat each other honor bright. How little to complain there'd be if I knew you and you knew me. Then let no doubting thoughts abide of firm good faith on either side. Living ourselves, let others live. But any time you come my way, that you will call, I hope and pray. Then face to face, we each shall see, and I'll know you, and you'll know me. In closing, I wrote a short note to the file when I discovered this poem in her papers. And I wrote, Maurice Tate, a political science and history professor at Howard back in the day, with a Harvard PhD and a stack of best-selling textbooks on diplomatic history and IR theory, could have held court any day of the week with top thinkers on asymmetric information, moral hazard, and adverse selection. In her papers, she left us this little poem that distills it all to its pure essence. That's it. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Raymond, for unhiding that hidden poet at Howard. Okay, so now we're coming down to our last presentation, which is going to bring up Miles David Moore up to the Zoom podium to talk about the wonderful run of readings known and remembered as the IOTA Poetry Series. Miles David Moore is the founder of the IOTA Poetry Series in Arlington, Virginia, which hosted from 1994 to 2017. He is the former board member of the WordWorks and the author of 4 books of poetry by my count: The Bears of Paris, Buddha Isn't Laughing, and Roller Coaster. And not to mention his most recently published book, which just came out, Man on Terrace with Wine. So sit back as Miles recounts the vivid history of the IOTA Poetry Series. Miles, take it away.
Thank you, Henry. And thank you all for Zooming in today. 2832 Wilson Boulevard, Arlington, Virginia, will always be a magical address for me. For 23 years, it was the address of IOTA Club and Cafe. IOTA was a famous place, so famous that in an episode of The West Wing, Bradley Whitford once looked up and said to the crowd in the White House, "Hey, let's all go over to IOTA." It was always a place where you could always go to get a good drink, a good meal, have a chat with Steve and Jane Negri, the very friendly proprietors and their very friendly wait staff. But it was famous as a showcase for national acts in rockabilly, alt country, and avant-garde rock. But the second Sunday of every month, it was the place for poetry. It all started in February 1994 when I was sitting around with a group of my friends, and we were all lamenting that there weren't any places to go and read for young poets to read their poetry. There were only two venues at that time, the old Club 15 Minutes and the Writer Center. My friend Jeff King looked up and said, well, if you're looking for a place that might be interested in poetry, there's a guy who just opened up a bar in Arlington and he's looking for anybody who can get people through the door. So I called him and I went with another friend, Marty Sanchez Lowry, to go speak to Stephen Negri. I forget what we said, but a few days later, he called me and said, you have the second Sunday of every month starting in September. And we went on to have 275 readings at IOTA. Only two were ever canceled, one for an ice storm and one for a water main break. Dean Bleart was the first reader to ever set foot on the IOTA stage on September 11th, 1994, and he was the very last to set foot on the IOTA stage on September 10th, 2017. In 1994, the program was Dean and me, followed by an open reading, as most of the readings would be. I think maybe there were 7 or 8 open readers. In 2017, at the last reading, it was an honor roll of some of the distinguished poets who had appeared in IOTA over the years. Karen Alanier, Kim Roberts, Jean Nordhaus, Don Illich, Herb Guggenheim, Luther Jett, Beth Kankowski, J.D. Smith, Nancy Naomi Carlson, Maggie Rosen, and me. There was never any formal application process for reading at IOTA. I just basically asked people I knew or took recommendations from friends whom I trusted. I was very proud of the fact that many of the open readers who found an early home at IOTA went on to become featured readers and then to establish very successful careers of their own. A short list includes Sandra Beasley, Bernadette Geyer, Kathy Wolf, Cynthia Hoffman, Mike McDermott, Jonathan Vale, Brandon Johnson, Catherine Young, Holly Karapetkova, Beth Kankowski, Herb Guggenheim, Kathy Morrison-Taylor, Gregory Luce, and Naomi Tears. They also had a lot of distinguished poets with famous reputations who came to the stage. Albert Jordan just told me that IOTA was the very first place that Lynn Lifshin read in the DC area after she moved here. It was also one of the very last places that my dear friend Hillary Tom ever read in public. I was honored to have both of my Jenny McKean Moore professors read at IOTA, Pablo Medina and John Haynes. I was also honored to help Steve Rogers plan the group reading in honor of the festschrift that he edited about John Haynes titled A Gradual Twilight. There was, as I said, there was no formal application process. There was one guy who sent in a DVD, an audition DVD from out of town. I looked at it and told him, sorry, we can't use you. He shot back a nasty note about how I and my audience could use a little poetic complexity in our place. I never told him the reason why I rejected him. Throughout the 25-minute audition DVD, he never looked up once from the page. If you would not acknowledge your audience, you had no place at IOTA. I was also honored to have a lot of poets I have always admired at Iota. A short list would include Rick Peabody, Kim Roberts, Grace Cavallari, Rose Solari, Merrill Leffler, the late Bob Sargent, again, Lynn, and two poets from Florida, Lola Haskins and Ruth Moon Kempfer. I'm probably not the person to ask about what was a typical reading at Iota like, because I was always too busy making sure that the featured readers were happy and making sure that the open readers didn't exceed their time. So the band that was going to start later in the evening didn't start shooting me nasty looks because they had to set up. But one thing I can tell you is that everybody who ever set foot in Iota talked about the warm and embracing atmosphere in the place. A lot of that was due to Steve and Jane, who always went out of their way to welcome the poets. Another aspect of it was the audience. They were there to hear poetry. They were very accepting of the poets. They were there to cheer every poet who came on stage, so that I think almost any poet who was nervous to sit on stage for the first time at Iota, their nervousness was gone by the second time because they knew they'd found a home. Besides Steve and Jane, there are a few people who I think of as like being the truly warm and accepting souls of Iota, the people who really, really helped me over the years. Two of them were, again, Marty Sanchez Lowry and her husband, Terry Mulligan. They produced the 10th and 20th anniversary CDs of readings at Iota. And that would never have happened if it had just been up to me. Among other things, my technical expertise is on a level with Samuel Johnson's. So Terry and Marty brought me into the 21st century. Another person who was really the warm heart of Iota was Teresa O'Rourke, who I always called Ireland's goodwill ambassador to Arlington. She would always come in wearing a jaunty beret and waving at the crowd, smiling. Sometimes she'd bring a box of candy or a bag of apples to share. And she was always number 13 on the open reading list. That was her lucky number. And she delighted the crowd with her original poetry and songs, and also singing old Irish favorites like Christmas in Killarney. And she passed away a few years ago. She will be sorely missed. As for Iota itself, I was there for so many years. I always just assumed Steve and Jane owned the building. I was wrong. A redevelopment program for Clarendon that came up in 2016 and 2017 would have forced them into temporary quarters for a few years, and then when they came back, the rents would have been astronomically higher. So they just decided it was simpler to close the place. I went to the party that Steve and Jane threw on one of the last days of operation. I partied with the crowd. Rick Peabody was there, so was Rose Solari, so it was a huge crowd. I ate, I drank, I accepted a shot of Jack Daniels from Steve. I drank it. I walked into the September night, and that was the end of Iota for me. And I'm profoundly grateful for everyone who made it work. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Miles. That was wonderful. I mean, you know everybody. You know everything about the list of people that you mentioned there is incredible, just incredible. Okay, so we're running a little long here, but we're going to try to do a little Q&A if we get any questions and if it's possible. And I'm going to call on any of our co-hosts to do this. In order to do this, you can go into the participants screen, and you can use the raise hand feature in the participant screen and raise your hand, and a blue hand will show up on our screen, and that'll signal to us that a question has been raised. And if we get a couple, we can take a couple, not many, but we may not get any at all. So let's take a quick look peek over there, see if we've got any. I don't see any. This is going to be one of those cases of going once, going twice. Anybody with a question? Okay, so, and then I have what is always one of the hardest things to do whenever I have been honored by being the host at Splendid Wake, and that is acknowledging honored guests. And it's extremely difficult because everybody's honored. If I started here today, I'd have to go through every rectangle on the screen, I think, and in order to name them. So I'll just really be very simple and say that we have been graciously visited by Maryland's poet laureate, Grace Cavalieri, and let's honor her for being here with us here today. And with that, I'll turn for, yes, let's give her a good hand. And then I will turn for closing remarks to someone who is one of the founding forces behind A Splendid Wake, Myra Sklarou. Myra.
Thank you very much. Can I be heard?
Yes.
No? Okay. We live under the strange guidance of a virus that scientists consider non-living because it can't reproduce itself, but we're not contained. Poetry has come to our rescue, and to honor those who have changed our landscape as you all have today. My thanks and our thanks to all of you for your beautiful words, for reminding us of the powerful readings and places for readings all through the district. I was especially grateful to Raymond Maxwell for talking about Merce Tate. And there are so many to be discovered. And Howard was a very important place and still is for poetry. And what was so interesting about it was that the people who came there were in many different disciplines, not particularly in literature, but who ended up being part of very important literary groups. And the places where there were public readings began to multiply. And so these are just parts, just a glimpse really, but there is a great deal more to be said and learned about Washington and its poets and its writers. So I thank you all for participating today, and I thank all of our guests who came to join us. And we'll be doing another program in March, so I hope that we'll all be back again in March. I thank you very much, Henry and Karen, and I'm leaving off names, but who took the burden of the work here. And I thank you for making all of this possible, particularly during a time when there's been so much to be concerned about. And I hope that our government will mend itself and will do it with joy, and that we can participate. My best to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of the presenters. I want to thank Myra Sklarou. I want to thank everybody for coming on out here today. It was a wonderful program with great presentations. Let's look forward to our next time. Maybe we meet in the Gelman Library. Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't it be nice to meet again with people in the actual real world rather than the virtual world? We don't know. But until that time, let's say thank you all, and so long from A Splendid Wake 8. Thank you for coming by.